Picture this: a grand medieval procession winding its way through a cobblestone street, the air thick with the scent of torch smoke and the distant hum of minstrels. Noble carriages, adorned in vibrant blues, deep reds, and shimmering golds, glide past one another, their colors catching the sunlight like polished gemstones. But look closer. Notice how the Duke of Burgundy's emerald green carriage lingers just a moment too long beside the Count of Flanders' sapphire blue one. Or how the Baroness of Aquitaine's crimson coach seems to deliberately avoid the silver and black of her supposed ally, the Lord of Provence. This wasn't just a parade of wealth, it was a silent battlefield of diplomacy, where every hue carried a hidden meaning, and every shade whispered secrets of alliances, betrayals, and power plays that could topple kingdoms. In a world where words could be intercepted and letters forged, the nobility turned to a language everyone could see but few could truly decipher: the colors of their carriages. A deep purple might signal loyalty to the crown, while a sudden shift to burgundy could hint at clandestine negotiations with a rival faction. Even the placement of colors, a stripe of white here, a crest of gold there, could reveal whether a lord was preparing for war or secretly brokering peace. These weren't arbitrary choices, they were deliberate, calculated signals in a high-stakes game where a single misstep could mean exile or worse. So what if we could crack this centuries-old code? What if, by understanding the hidden meanings behind these colors, we could uncover the secret pacts that shaped the fate of nations? Today, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on one of history's most fascinating and overlooked forms of communication. From the scarlet betrayals that sparked wars to the golden alliances that forged empires, we'll decode the true stories behind these rolling masterpieces of intrigue. This isn't just a tale of paint and fabric. It's a journey into the heart of medieval power, where the right color could mean the difference between a throne and a dungeon. Ready to see history in a whole new light? Let's begin. In medieval Europe, color wasn't just decoration, it was a language of power, woven into the very fabric of society. Take royal purple, a shade so rare and expensive to produce that for centuries, its use was restricted by law to emperors and kings. Wearing it without permission could cost you your head. But purple wasn't alone in its prestige. The church draped its cardinals in crimson, a color symbolizing both the blood of martyrs and the unshakable authority of Rome. Meanwhile, the deep blues of ultramarine, painstakingly ground from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, adorned the robes of the Virgin Mary in sacred art, broadcasting a family's wealth and piety with every brushstroke. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were statements carved into stone, stitched into tapestries, and painted across palace walls. When the Duke of Berry commissioned his famous illuminated manuscripts, he insisted on using more gold leaf than any other noble in France, not because he particularly liked shiny things, but because that excess was the visual equivalent of a trumpet blast announcing his status. In tournaments, knights didn't just clash with lances, their surcoats screamed allegiances through carefully chosen hues. A knight wearing the black and gold of Bavaria sent a very different message than one sporting the red and white of England's House of Lancaster. But nowhere was this color-coded messaging more dangerous than in the world of carriages. A noble switching from their family's traditional green to the silver of a rival house wasn't just redecorating. They might as well have sent a declaration of war by courier. In 1523, when the French king's sister was spotted riding in a carriage lined with the imperial yellow of the Habsburgs, the court erupted in whispers of betrayal. That single color choice forced her to publicly swear allegiance to France while burning the offending cushions in the palace courtyard. The most cunning nobles played this game with terrifying precision. The Medici family famously used their signature red not just on buildings and banners, but on the upholstery of every diplomatic carriage sent abroad, a rolling reminder of their influence. Meanwhile, the Spanish court developed an entire hierarchy of carriage colors: black for mourning, white for royal weddings, and a specific shade of golden yellow reserved exclusively for meetings with papal legates. Get the shade wrong, and you risked insulting the Vatican itself. This visual language became so precise that during peace negotiations, observers would scrutinize not just the words spoken, but the colors of the cushions beneath the diplomats. A sudden appearance of Savoy blue in a French delegation might hint at secret negotiations with Italian city-states. The presence of too much English scarlet at a Burgundian feast could explain why the Duke's soldiers suddenly appeared at the border. In an age before newspapers and instant communication, these rolling displays of color were the social media of their day, broadcasting alliances, feuds, and ambitions to anyone fluent enough in their vivid vocabulary. What made this system so powerful was its deniability. A lord could always claim his choice of azure over cerulean was simply a matter of taste, while everyone at court understood the precise insult being delivered. When Elizabeth I of England received the French ambassador in a carriage upholstered entirely in black and white, the colors of her rival Mary, Queen of Scots, the message needed no translation. The same colors that celebrated weddings and births could, with subtle adjustments, become declarations of Cold War. This was politics painted in broad strokes, where every hue carried the weight of armies, and the right shade could make kings tremble. At first glance, a medieval carriage might seem like just a wooden box on wheels, but in the hands of Europe's nobility, it became a masterpiece of political theater. These weren't mere vehicles, they were armored statements on axles, engineered to dazzle, intimidate, and deceive. Craftsmen spent months carving gilded crests into every panel, while weavers labored over tapestries threaded with real silver. The paint alone could cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings, mixed from crushed gemstones and rare pigments hauled across continents. Why such extravagance? Because in a world where power was performative, your carriage wasn't just how you traveled, it was how you ruled. Take the legendary Golden Chariot of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a rolling fortress draped in cloth of gold so thick it took 12 horses to pull. Its crimson interior, stitched with black eagles, wasn't just opulent, it screamed imperial ambition to every duke and bishop who glimpsed it. Meanwhile, over in England, Henry VIII's infamous divorce carriage told a different story. Originally emblazoned with the pomegranate symbol of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, he had it hastily repainted with Anne Boleyn's white falcon crest mid-journey to London. That single color change sent shockwaves through Christendom, signaling a royal marriage and a religious reformation in real time. The artistry behind these machines was as precise as any battle strategy. Master painters layered colors like diplomats crafting treaties: Venetian red for strength, Tyrian purple for divine right, forest green for territorial claims. Subtle shifts in shade carried enormous weight. When the Duke of Milan switched from his family's traditional azure to a slightly grayer blue, spies reported it as a coded nod to the French king, a hint that their secret peace talks were progressing. Even the undercarriage mattered. Nobles often painted hidden symbols beneath their carriages, visible only when the vehicle tilted, like the Florentine Medici's discreet fleur de lis acknowledging their French backers. Some carriages became so iconic they shaped history. The black coach of Sweden's Queen Christina, lacquered in ominous darkness with silver skull motifs, wasn't just a Gothic fashion statement, it broadcast her defiance of papal authority during tense negotiations with Rome. When Poland's king rolled into Vienna in a carriage entirely sheathed in amber, the Habsburg court instantly recognized it as a threat. Amber was Prussia's treasure, and this display hinted at a dangerous new alliance. But perhaps the most cunning use of carriage diplomacy came from France's Louis XIV. His sun chariot, dripping in gold leaf with wheels painted as radiating sunbeams, did more than flaunt his wealth. It transformed every road into an extension of his palace. Ambassadors knew that being granted an audience in this mobile throne room meant you'd already lost the negotiation. The very colors surrounding you declared the king's absolute dominance. Yet even the Sun King's brilliance couldn't outshine the ultimate power move. When the Ottoman Sultan sent a delegation to Versailles, their emerald green carriages were deliberately designed to eclipse Louis' gold in height, forcing French officials to hastily raise the palace gate's arches overnight. In this high-stakes game of chromatic chess, a scratched paint job could spark international incidents. Records show Venetian diplomats once refused to disembark from their boat until the Duke of Ferrara's two similar blue carriages were moved from the dock. The wrong shade at the wrong moment didn't just risk embarrassment, it could unravel years of careful alliance building. That's why noble households employed color stewards, experts who tracked rival families' palette shifts like modern analysts monitoring stock markets. Their ledgers read like war plans. Burgundy deepens red, prepare for hostilities, or Savoy adds silver trim, possible Milanese reconciliation. What makes these rolling canvases so fascinating is how they turned something as fleeting as a shade of paint into a language that toppled dynasties. The next time you see a historical painting of a grand procession, don't just look at the faces, study the carriages. That stripe of unexpected yellow. That could be a queen's silent plea for help. Those unmarked black wheels may be a spy's last chance to warn his king. In a world before passwords and encrypted messages, color was the code that unlocked empires. Public events like royal weddings and tournaments weren't just celebrations, they were carefully choreographed stages where nobles waged silent wars of color. Picture a jousting tournament where knights thunder down the lists, their armor gleaming, while along the sidelines a far subtler competition unfolds. The Duke of Lorraine arrives in a carriage of deep indigo, a shade suspiciously close to the King of France's own royal blue. A few paces behind, the Count of Champagne rolls in with silver accents that perfectly match the Queen's embroidery. To the untrained eye, it's mere coincidence, but to the courtiers whispering behind fans, these choices scream political alignment without a single treasonous word being spoken. This was the delicate dance of display politics. When the Holy Roman Emperor's niece married the Spanish crown prince in 1543, diplomats didn't just note who attended, they scrutinized the exact shades of the carriages in the procession. The Venetian delegation's unexpected use of Spanish crimson instead of their traditional gold signaled their shifting loyalties months before any treaty was signed. Meanwhile, the English contingent's refusal to incorporate Habsburg black into their livery despite direct requests hinted at tensions that would later erupt into war. Even the order of carriages mattered. Positioning your vehicle too close to a rival's could imply forced deference, while hanging back might suggest secret negotiations. But missteps carried brutal consequences. At a 1520s tournament celebrating the Truce of Calais, the Duke of Burgundy's decision to outfit his entire retinue in English white and green down to the carriage linings nearly reignited the 100 Years' War. French observers took it as a blatant challenge, forcing the Duke to publicly burn the offending liveries in a humiliating display of contrition. Similarly, when the Medici family accidentally sent a delegation to Rome in carriages trimmed with the wrong shade of papal yellow, Pope Paul III allegedly refused to see them for 3 weeks until they repainted every panel. The most skilled observers became human spectrometers of diplomacy. Ambassadors' dispatches often read like paint swatch catalogues. The Elector of Saxony's new cerulean suggests Brandenburg influence, or notice the absence of Bavarian blue in the imperial procession. Some nobles even employed artists to sketch rival carriages in meticulous detail, studying how color placements evolved over time. A sudden addition of orange piping might indicate Dutch backing, while an overabundance of fleur-de-lis motifs could betray French financial support. What makes this system so fascinating is its duality. It allowed nobles to communicate in plain sight while maintaining plausible deniability. When the Queen of Navarre infamously rode into Paris in a violet carriage during her brother's reign, everyone knew it echoed the mourning color of their deposed dynasty. Yet when confronted, she could innocently claim it was simply her favorite hue. This visual doublespeak reached its peak during the War of the Roses, where rival factions used nearly identical shades of red and white, forcing observers to decode meaning from microscopic differences in saturation and trim. By the late Renaissance, the language of carriage colors had grown so complex that some courts published unofficial color dictionaries to help newcomers navigate the unspoken rules. The surviving Medici archives contain pages debating whether to use Florentine red or Roman purple for a papal visit, a decision that could mean the difference between a lucrative contract and excommunication. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, the Reichstag occasionally had to mediate disputes over conflicting color claims, like the infamous Scarlet Schism of 1589, where 3 different principalities insisted they alone had rights to a particular shade of crimson. These silent chromatic battles remind us that history isn't just written in treaties and battles. It's painted in the careful strokes of a carriage door, the strategic fold of a curtain, the barely perceptible shift from cobalt to azure that could make or break a kingdom's fate. In the spring of 1492, the courts of Europe buzzed with a scandal written in scarlet. 2 bitter rivals, the Duke of Orleans and the Count of Armagnac, rolled into the French king's coronation in carriages painted an identical, blazing shade of red. Not just any red, but the precise vermilion reserved for royal blood relatives. The shock was palpable. These men had spent decades feuding over borderlands, trading insults in parliament, and even skirmishing with private armies. Yet here they were, their carriages mirroring each other down to the gilded trim, like twin torches signaling some unthinkable pact. The context made this display even more explosive. France was still reeling from the English wars, with nobles jockeying for favor as the young king consolidated power. Orleans, descended from a cadet branch of the royal family, had always worn his blue and gold livery like a challenge to the throne. Armagnac, whose lands bordered English territories, had built his reputation on hating anyone who flirted with foreign alliances. For them to suddenly adopt the king's red wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. Contemporary chroniclers dissected every detail. The Venetian ambassador noted how both carriages bore an unusual pattern of white lilies along the doors, a motif previously used only by the king's immediate family. A Burgundian spy reported that the horses wore matching scarlet caparisons, a touch so coordinated it had to be planned. Most damning, the carriages arrived within moments of each other, pausing side by side in the courtyard long enough for the entire court to witness their synchronized display. Rumors exploded like cannon fire. Some whispered the men had secretly married into each other's families. Others suspected a joint plot to overthrow the king, with Scarlet serving as their battle standard. The most paranoid theory claimed the English had brokered their peace, using Armagnac's connections to turn Orleans against the crown. The truth, uncovered years later in private letters, was both simpler and more cunning. Facing royal pressure to end their feud, the two lords had staged the Carriage spectacle as mutual protection, a flamboyant show of false unity to avoid being stripped of their titles. The aftermath proved how dangerous such signals could be. Within months, their alliance crumbled when Armagnac was caught funding mercenaries against Orleans' allies. But the Scarlet Carriages had done lasting damage. The king, initially pleased by their apparent reconciliation, took their later discord as personal betrayal, exiling both men's sons. Meanwhile, lesser nobles began copying the tactic, using coordinated colors to imply strength in numbers, until the court became a kaleidoscope of deception where no hue could be trusted. This incident reveals the double-edged sword of color diplomacy. A bold shade could unite rivals in the public eye, as when the red sails of Venetian and Genoese merchant ships temporarily flew together to deter pirates. But just as often, it was a weapon of misdirection. The Habsburgs famously painted prisoners' carriages imperial yellow during transfers, making them look like honored guests to thwart rescue attempts. In 1511, a German baron averted invasion by having his entire train repainted in the colors of a much stronger neighbor, a bluff that held until reinforcements arrived. The true genius of these schemes lay in their ambiguity. Unlike a signed treaty, a carriage's color could always be explained away as personal taste or artistic license. A lord might swear his emerald green upholstery had no connection to the Irish rebels, just as a merchant could claim his azure carriage trim wasn't a nod to French tariffs. This deniability made color the perfect medium for testing alliances without commitment, a way to float trial balloons before the age of newspapers or telegrams. What makes the Scarlet conspiracy so enduringly fascinating isn't just the theatrics, but what it reveals about human nature. Centuries before psychology named it signaling theory, medieval nobles understood that symbols could shape reality. Paint a dozen carriages the same crimson, and suddenly you've invented solidarity. Switch your livery overnight, and you've rewritten history without penning a single word. In an era when perception was power, color wasn't just decoration, it was alchemy, turning whispers into armies and doubt into dominion. Gold wasn't just a color in medieval courts, it was sunlight captured in pigment, a visual declaration of divine right. When kings rolled through cities in gilded carriages, the message was unmistakable. This was earthly power touched by heaven itself. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III took this to extremes, insisting his entire traveling court use carriages lacquered with real gold leaf, forcing local hosts to provide armed guards lest peasants scratch off precious flakes. But gold's meaning shifted at the edges of empires. In Venetian territories, a gilded carriage door might signal vast trade wealth rather than royal blood, while in papal lands, it strictly denoted ecclesiastical privilege, lay nobles caught using too much risked excommunication. Deep Blue told a different story, one written in the ink of merchant ledgers and maritime charts. The ultramarine carriages of Genoese banking dynasties weren't just displays of wealth, they were walking balance sheets. This pigment, imported at ruinous cost from Afghan mines, proved a family could move fortunes across continents. When the Medici wanted to intimidate French creditors, they sent negotiators in carriages upholstered with lapis lazuli velvet, the fabric literally worth its weight in silver. But in the Baltic, that same blue took on new meaning. Hanseatic League members adopted a distinctive cobalt to mark their cartels, so when Danish spies spotted 3 matching blue carriages outside a Riga tavern, they knew northern grain prices were about to be fixed. Forest green whispered of earthier powers, the quiet might of agrarian lords who fed armies and financed wars through harvests. England's Percy family painted their carriages with malachite green wheels as a reminder that their northern estates could starve London if provoked. Yet in Italy, the same shade signaled something darker. The Visconti dynasty's famous serpent green carriages, striped with white like venomous snakes, became synonymous with their reputation for slow, suffocating takeovers of rival city-states. A French diplomat once quipped that receiving an invitation delivered in a Visconti green carriage was like being hugged by a boa constrictor. You only realized the danger when it was too late. Regional variations turned this color code into a linguistic minefield. The scarlet that meant joyous celebration in Spanish Andalusia signaled mourning in parts of Germany. Burgundian nobles used black and white checkered carriage trim to honor their dukes, while Polish lords saw the pattern as a deliberate insult referencing their defeated Teutonic foes. Even the innocent-seeming rose pink could spark international incidents. When the Margrave of Brandenburg unknowingly sent his daughter to a Saxon wedding in carriages lined with what he considered festive pink, the bride's family nearly called off the ceremony, interpreting the shade as a reference to the groom's rumored Habsburg bastardy. Misreading these nuances had consequences beyond embarrassment. In 1488, a Hungarian count's decision to repaint his carriages in what he thought was friendly Venetian blue accidentally matched the exact shade used by Ottoman slave traders along the Dalmatian coast. By the time he reached the imperial diet, half the delegates refused to speak with him, convinced he was secretly funded by the Sultan. A century later, the Duke of Württemberg's attempt to flatter French allies with lilac-trimmed carriages backfired catastrophically. Unknown to him, that particular lavender had recently been adopted by a faction plotting to poison the French king. His innocent gesture nearly got him tried as a co-conspirator before frantic color experts could explain the misunderstanding. The most dangerous colors were those in flux. When Protestant reformers began using unadorned white carriages to symbolize purity of faith, Catholic nobles had to carefully adjust their own palettes to avoid accidental alignment. The infamous Beige Crisis of 1561 saw half the German nobility repainting their fleets overnight after a Lutheran pamphlet declared the neutral tone the only morally acceptable color for Christian lords. For months, spies had to decipher whether a beige carriage signaled religious fervor or mere indecisiveness. What emerges from these stories isn't just a simple color chart, but a living language that breathed with the politics of its time. A duke's carriage might sport 20 different blues across his lifetime, each subtle shift tracking alliances made and broken, favors granted and revoked. To modern eyes, these hues might blend into a generic, old painting palette, but to medieval observers, every thread in a carriage tapestry, every highlight on a painted shield, was a headline screaming the latest political developments. The real miracle isn't that they occasionally misread these signals, it's that anyone managed to navigate this chromatic minefield at all. To understand why a medieval noble would rather lose a castle than misplace a paintbrush, we need to step into the world of heraldry, Europe's original branding system. Coats of arms weren't just family logos, they were legal documents in visual form, declaring everything from bloodlines to land claims with a single glance. The same rules that governed a knight's shield applied to his carriage, turning every journey into a moving heraldic display. When the Duke of Brittany's coach rolled through Paris sporting ermine spots and gold crosses, it wasn't just pretty decoration, it was a territorial claim on wheels, broadcasting his ancestral right to rule as clearly as if he'd unfurled a parchment treaty. Heralds served as the ultimate arbiters of this chromatic code. These color scholars, trained for years in the arcane symbolism of tinctures and ordinaries, were the medieval equivalent of corporate lawyers specializing in visual trademarks. Before any major event, nobles paid heralds hefty fees to inspect their carriages, ensuring every hue and pattern complied with strict heraldic law. A misplaced fleur-de-lis or an incorrectly proportioned stripe could imply false royal connections, a crime punishable by having your carriage publicly dismantled. Records from the English College of Arms reveal how heralds even maintained sample swatches of approved shades, settling disputes over whether a lord's crimson carriage trim too closely resembled the king's own scarlet. The genius of heraldic carriage design lay in its layered messaging. While static coats of arms on castle walls declared permanent allegiances, mobile versions on carriages allowed for real-time political maneuvering. The Duke of Burgundy famously tweaked his carriage's heraldic colors during diplomatic missions, adding more imperial black when negotiating with the Holy Roman Emperor, then emphasizing French gold floors when courting Parisian favor. This wasn't just vanity. Heralds documented how such adjustments consistently yielded better treaty terms, proving color psychology worked centuries before marketing experts coined the term. Some families developed entire visual vocabularies through carriage heraldry. The Medici didn't simply plaster their red balls on a background, they used specific arrangements to signal intentions. A carriage with 6 evenly spaced balls announced peaceful trade missions, while a clustered trio warned of impending military action. The Visconti serpent wasn't always biting its tail. The creature's posture changed to indicate whether the family was seeking alliances or preparing for war. Even the humble border design held meaning. A sawtooth pattern on a Spanish duke's carriage edge explicitly referenced his right to levy tolls, a detail tax collectors watched for. Heralds also functioned as medieval PR consultants, helping nobles craft carriage designs that played to public sentiment. During the Great Famine of 1315, the Count of Hainault's herald convinced him to replace his usual silver-leafed carriage with a simpler blue one lined with sheaves of wheat, a visual promise of grain distribution that quelled riots more effectively than armed guards. Conversely, when the Duke of Milan needed to project strength during succession disputes, his heralds designed a carriage so thickly emblazoned with family crests that critics joked it needed extra axles to support its ego. This system reached its artistic peak in bridal processions, where heraldic carriage displays became a form of dynastic theater. When Anne of Bohemia married England's Richard II, her procession featured 12 carriages, each meticulously painted to display quartered arms showing every major alliance her union would create. Contemporary accounts describe how Londoners spontaneously cheered certain color combinations they recognized as favorable to trade, while groaning at others hinting at new taxes, proof that even commoners could read this visual language. The darker side of this practice emerged in warfare. Savvy commanders used captured heraldic carriage panels as psychological weapons during the Wars of the Roses. The Yorkists famously displayed the Lancastrian prince's gold and crimson carriage doors on their own vehicles after battles, a move modern historians compare to hacking an enemy's social media. The practice became so disruptive that the Imperial Diet eventually banned battlefield heraldic mimicry in 1494, though covert versions persisted for centuries. What makes heraldic carriage colors so fascinating is how they transformed rigid medieval hierarchy into a dynamic communication tool. A lord might spend years petitioning the king to officially recognize a new branch of his family tree, but with a cleverly designed carriage, he could unofficially float the idea to the entire court overnight. The next time you see a Renaissance painting of a grand procession, don't just admire the pageantry. Study how the carriage colors interact with banners and costumes. That's not just decoration, it's a meticulously choreographed ballet of power, where every brushstroke carried the weight of law and the whisper of ambition. In the shadowy world of medieval espionage, carriage colors weren't just displays of power, they were intelligence goldmines. Spies didn't lurk in taverns eavesdropping for whispers of treason. They loitered near stables, memorizing paint shades and counting how many times a noble's coach turned up in unexpected hues. The Spanish ambassador to England kept a coded ledger tracking Henry VII's carriage colors, convinced that sudden shifts from Tudor green to Burgundian black hinted at secret negotiations with Flanders. Venetian agents went further, bribing painters to steal pigment recipes, knowing the chemical composition of a rival's ultramarine could reveal which Afghan mines financed their wars. The most skilled intelligence operatives became walking color catalogs. A surviving Habsburg spy manual from 1522 includes detailed swatches labeled with political meanings. Duke of Ferrara's new peach tint equals French pension suspected, or Saxon silver streaks equals possible Polish marriage alliance. These weren't guesses, they were deductions based on years of tracking how specific shades traveled across Europe like visual gossip. When the Medici Bank suddenly ordered shipments of rare Turkish red, Florentine informants correctly predicted their backing of Ottoman trade deals months before official announcements. But where there were spies, counterintelligence followed. Nobles developed ingenious methods to turn their carriages into weapons of mass deception. The Duke of Milan's engineers devised reversible leather panels that could flip between Visconti green and Sforza crimson mid-journey, a trick used to confuse assassins waiting at crossroads. French diplomats traveling through Italy wore out 6 horses per day, deliberately alternating between royal blue and papal yellow carriages, creating conflicting reports about their true mission. Some lords even employed color doubles, decoy carriages painted in identical schemes but sent on fake routes to mislead trackers. The most audacious gambit occurred during the War of the League of Cambrai, when the entire Venetian delegation to Rome repainted their carriages overnight. Arriving in traditional gold, they secretly hired artisans to overlay the panels with Florentine red while parked inside the Vatican stables. Next morning, shocked cardinals found what appeared to be Medici allies where Venetians had stood, a visual lie that bought crucial days to undermine the papal alliance against them. Contemporary accounts describe rival ambassadors pressing handkerchiefs against fresh paint to check for wet pigment, while frantic messengers compared notes on when exactly Venice had adopted Medici livery. These tactics mirrored larger strategies of medieval information warfare. Just as generals used feints and false banners on battlefields, diplomats employed chromatic ambushes in peacetime. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III once ordered 3 identical golden carriages to take different roads to Frankfurt, forcing hostile princes to split their forces. English spies during the 100 Years' War would temporarily paint captured French carriages in Plantagenet colors, then accidentally leave them where enemy scouts would find them. Early psychological operations designed to breed paranoia. Yet the greatest deception wasn't in copying colors, but in weaponizing their absence. When the King of Hungary needed to conceal his movements, he didn't disguise his carriage. He traveled in an unmarked black wagon while a gaudy decoy procession drew all attention. This anti-spectacle tactic proved so effective that by the late Renaissance, the most powerful men often moved in deliberately drab vehicles, understanding that invisibility could be more potent than any display. The real masters of medieval spycraft knew that while colors could lie, sometimes the most dangerous truth was hiding in plain sight. While nobles and kings waged their chromatic wars, an even subtler revolution was rolling through Europe's streets, one financed not by crowns, but by merchant guilds and banking houses. The richest burghers, barred by law from wearing noble purples or royal scarlets, developed their own visual language through carriage colors. In Bruges, a wool merchant's indigo blue coach wasn't just a status symbol. It was a carefully calculated middle finger to the aristocracy. That particular shade, derived from woad plants grown on his own estates, declared he owed his wealth to no duke's patronage. Over in Florence, silk traders deliberately chose coral red carriages to echo the hues of Byzantine imperial silks they now controlled through trade routes, a not-so-subtle reminder of where real economic power lay. This wasn't mere imitation of the nobility, it was strategic subversion. When the Fugger banking family of Augsburg began rolling through the Holy Roman Empire in carriages painted with Fugger red, a custom shade blending Venetian crimson with German ochre, they weren't just showing off. That unique color became a trademark, appearing on everything from their loan contracts to their mercenary uniforms. Soon, princes found themselves trapped in a bizarre reversal. To secure Fugger loans, they had to incorporate the banker's signature red into their own livery, effectively becoming walking advertisements for the family's financial empire. A 15th-century cartoon captures the absurdity: a bishop, a duke, and a landgrave standing awkwardly beside matching Fugger red carriages, their traditional heraldry reduced to tiny crests beside the banking clan's sprawling golden F. The merchant class's most brilliant innovation was turning color into commercial leverage. In Venice, the powerful arsenal shipbuilders enforced an unspoken rule. Any noble wanting preferential access to their warships had to adopt their signature, arsenal green, on at least one family carriage. This spread the color across Italy like a corporate logo, making the shipyard's influence visible in every ducal procession. Meanwhile, English wool merchants used their distinctive stapler blue carriages as mobile negotiating tools, parking them outside Parliament when demanding favorable trade laws, knowing the collective display of identical hues demonstrated their unified economic might. But this visual rebellion had its risks. In Ghent, a brewer who dared to paint his carriage in the same deep violet as the Count of Flanders' household had his vehicle confiscated and publicly smashed, with the noble soldiers using the wreckage to build a roadside gibbet as a warning. Yet even such brutality couldn't stop the tide. By the late Renaissance, certain merchant colors carried such prestige that cash-strapped nobles began quietly adopting them. The Spanish Duke of Alba, desperate to fund his campaigns against the Dutch, repainted his ancestral black carriages with amber trim, the exact shade used by Antwerp's diamond traders who secretly bankrolled him. Overnight, the streets of Madrid buzzed with shocked whispers. A grandee of Castile was now rolling in a banker's colors. What makes this merchant color revolution so fascinating is how it redrew social boundaries without a single battle. When the Medici rose from wool merchants to de facto rulers of Florence, their carriages didn't suddenly switch to noble hues. They forced the nobility to adopt Medici red. In Nuremberg, patrician families created an entire civic heraldry system where carriage colors corresponded to guild membership rather than feudal rank. A wine merchant's ruby red wheels held equal ceremonial weight with a knight's silver ones during city processions, a visual democracy that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The ultimate testament to this power shift came from an unlikely source: paint itself. The explosion of merchant wealth funded new pigment technologies, cheaper blues from cobalt mines, stable yellows from antimony, that undercut the nobility's monopoly on rare colors. By the 1600s, a Frankfurt cloth merchant could commission a carriage in shades once reserved for kings, while courtiers found themselves haggling over prices with artisans who now served wealthier bourgeois clients. The same wheels that had carried noble crests for centuries were now spinning in the service of a new world order, one where the right shade of indigo could open doors that birthright alone could not. In the grand theater of medieval Christianity, color wasn't just decoration, it was theology made visible, rolling through the streets on creaking carriage wheels. Picture the scene, a bishop's gilded coach, its panels shimmering with gold leaf so thick it could blind onlookers in sunlight, lumbering past a humble Franciscan wagon clad in undyed oak and rough hemp. This wasn't just a difference in taste, it was a deliberate collision of ideologies, where every hue preached louder than any sermon. The church hierarchy understood color's power better than anyone. When papal legates traveled, their carriages blazed in scarlet and white, the exact shades of Christ's wounds and purity, transforming each journey into a mobile catechism. Cardinal archbishops took this further, commissioning carriages where the interiors matched their titular church's mosaics. One visiting Spanish prelate's vehicle reportedly contained over 50 shades of blue to mimic the Virgin's cloak in Toledo Cathedral. But the real masters of chromatic messaging were the rival popes during the Great Schism. Clement VII in Avignon ordered his entire carriage fleet repainted in true passion purple, a custom blend incorporating crushed amethyst to symbolize his claim as Christ's authentic vicar. Meanwhile in Rome, Urban VI, countered with carriages lined in martyr's crimson, dyed with Kermes insects from Jerusalem to prove his bloodline to St. Peter. Monastic orders weaponized austerity as effectively as their superiors flaunted opulence. Dominican friars famously traveled in carriages painted with lime wash, not because they couldn't afford pigment, but because the unstable mixture flaked off during journeys, leaving a trail of white dust that literally marked their path of poverty. Cistercian wagons took this further, using iron oxide-rich mud from their own fields to stain the wood a somber brown, declaring their connection to the earth. But even humility could be strategic. When the Franciscans needed to sway public opinion against wealthy bishops, they deliberately parked their splintery, unadorned carriages outside cathedral doors during synods, a silent rebuke that turned peasant sympathies into political leverage. The most fascinating battles occurred between rival reform movements. During the 14th century, debates over clerical wealth, the spiritual Franciscans, a radical faction advocating absolute poverty, constructed carriages that were essentially mobile dioramas. Their wagons had one side painted in lavish gold to represent corrupt clergy, while the other side showed bare wood crawling with carved locusts, a nod to Revelation's warnings. As these wagons rolled through towns, attendants would rotate them to convert the display, drawing crowds that often turned into protests against local bishops. Yet for all this symbolism, nothing matched the chromatic arms race between papal claimants. When three men simultaneously claimed St. Peter's throne during the Council of Constance, their supporters turned carriage colors into theological artillery. John XXIII's faction used mercury-based vermilion to paint their vehicles, a nod to his alleged alchemical studies, only for opponents to spread rumors the pigment was mixed with heretics' blood. Benedict XIII retaliated with azure carriages lined in silver stars, asserting his divine mandate through celestial imagery. Meanwhile, Gregory XII's envoys rolled in humble white, but with a cunning twist. Their horses wore caparisons gradually darkening from nose to tail, visually arguing that only Gregory could guide the church from darkness into light. These sacred color wars reveal a profound truth about medieval power. Even the most spiritual claims needed earthly validation. A pope might quote scripture to prove his legitimacy, but it was the sight of his ruby-red carriage cresting the hill that made peasants kneel. Reformers could preach poverty from pulpits, but it was their mud-spattered wagons parked outside taverns that turned theory into revolution. In an age where few could read Latin, these rolling canvases became the Bible the masses could actually understand, a testament to the enduring power of seeing over hearing, of color over word. Festivals transformed medieval cities into living chessboards, where every carriage procession was a move in a high-stakes game of political signaling. Take the famous Tournament of the Golden Rose in 1534, where the streets of Lyon became a swirling canvas of deception. At first glance, the pageant appeared perfectly harmonious, dozens of nobles rolling past in coordinated shades of cream and gold, their carriages adorned with identical white roses to honor the French queen. But those who knew how to look noticed the cracks in this gilded facade. The Duke of Guise's roses were edged in faint silver, not the prescribed gilt, a silent protest against the crown's recent land seizures. The Spanish delegation's carriages, though officially cream, leaned suspiciously toward the Habsburg yellow forbidden by protocol, and most telling of all, the conspicuous absence of any Burgundian red in the procession. Though their envoys sat prominently in the stands, their empty carriages a louder statement than any herald's trumpet. What seemed like festive unity was actually a masterclass in passive aggression. The Holy Roman Emperor's representatives later confessed in coded letters that they deliberately used slightly faded gold leaf on their carriage doors, knowing sunlight would make them appear duller than the French kings, a visual metaphor for their waning support of the alliance. Meanwhile, Venetian spies reported how the Florentine delegation's carriage wheels, though painted the required white, left faint green streaks on the cobblestones from an underlayer of Medici pigment. These weren't accidents, they were calculated leaks of information, like a modern politician's intentional, off-the-record remark. The true genius of these displays lay in their plausible deniability. When challenged about his carriage's unauthorized silver trim, the Duke of Lorraine claimed it was merely tarnish from coastal air. The English ambassadors blamed their overly scarlet cushions on a dyer's error, though conveniently, that particular red matched the livery of rebellious Irish lords they were secretly funding. Even the church played this game. Papal legates attending the festival parked their traditional white carriages just outside the city gates, then entered in unmarked vehicles to avoid officially endorsing factions. For contemporary observers, these inconsistencies became a kind of political weather vane. The chronicler Pierre de Bourdet recorded how merchants would rush to adjust commodity prices based on which noble carriages arrived together. Knowing a mismatched color scheme today could mean a trade embargo tomorrow. When the Duke of Savoy's normally azure carriages appeared at a Milanese festival with unexpected flecks of French fleur-de-lis gold, wool markets in Genoa plummeted within hours, anticipating redirected trade routes. The most telling moments often came after dark, when torches and lanterns altered color perceptions. At the Feast of St. John in 1487, the King of Naples secretly ordered his carriages repainted during the nighttime procession, switching from Angevin blue to Aragonese red while moving through shadowed streets. By dawn, confused diplomats were left arguing whether they'd witnessed a change of allegiance or a trick of the light. This deliberate manipulation of perception reached its peak during the infamous Mask of Colors in 1512, where nobles wore lenses tinted to distort rival carriages' hues. Some reported seeing enemies' vehicles as blackened ruins, others as glowing with divine light, depending on which faction held the lens maker's loyalty. What makes these festival deceptions so compelling is how they reveal the fragility of medieval power structures. A duke might spend months preparing his carriage livery for a single procession, knowing that one off-hue thread could unravel years of careful diplomacy. The next time you see a Renaissance painting of a festival scene, don't just admire the pageantry, study the colors that don't quite match, the crests placed slightly askew. Those imperfections weren't oversights, they were the whispers of history waiting to be decoded. Behind every politically charged carriage color lay a scientific alchemy as carefully guarded as state secrets. To create Tyrian purple, the legendary dye reserved for emperors, Mediterranean craftsmen harvested thousands of murex sea snails, each yielding a single drop of mucus that fermented into that coveted royal hue. The stench of rotting shellfish was so overpowering that dye workshops stood miles outside city walls, yet the resulting color became so synonymous with power that Byzantine emperors signed documents in purple ink under penalty of death. Similarly, the vivid reds adorning cardinals' carriages came from Kermes insects, parasitic creatures scraped from Mediterranean oak trees. It took 70,000 dried female insects to dye one cloak, making this blood of the gods pigment worth more than gold by weight, a luxury only the church and wealthiest nobles could flaunt without inviting accusations of blasphemous pride. The rarity of these dyes wasn't just about cost, it was about control. Venice's monopoly on ultramarine blue, ground from Afghan lapis lazuli, gave the Republic power to literally color code alliances. When the Doge gifted a shipment to the French king, it came with strict instructions: misuse this celestial blue on unauthorized carriages, and Venetian galleys would embargo your ports. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Inquisition tracked cochineal red imports from the New World like military intelligence, knowing the vibrant Mexican insect dye could undermine Europe's entire Kermes-based economy if it fell into rival hands. Some pigments carried danger beyond politics. The arsenic-based greens that made Tudor carriages so distinctive also poisoned stable boys who brushed against wet paint. A notorious incident in 1542 saw two Hungarian counts collapse after inhaling fumes from their newly painted mercury vermilion carriage, a shade so toxic artists called it dragon's blood. Even seemingly innocuous yellows hid risks. The popular lead tin oxide used for golden accents caused dementia among carriage painters, earning it the grim nickname Gilder's Folly. Yet the greatest alchemical feats weren't in creating colors, but in faking them. Resourceful merchants developed ingenious forgeries to skirt royal restrictions, boiling walnut husks to mimic Tyrian purple, or mixing madder root with ox blood to approximate Kermes red. The most audacious scam unfolded in Augsburg, where a Jewish dyer named Elias Ambrot perfected a counterfeit ultramarine using ground blue glass and egg whites. His arrest records reveal how he supplied dozens of minor nobles with imperial blue carriages until the ruse was uncovered by a rainstorm that washed the color off a bishop's procession. This constant tension between authenticity and imitation created a bizarre underground economy. In London's Cheapside, back-alley dyers offered sunset sessions, a secret dawn appointments to tint carriage fabrics before authorities noticed illegal hues. Parisian nobles maintained color laundries across the Channel in Calais, where prohibited shades could be applied far from royal inspectors. Even nature played along. When the King of Denmark banned all non-royal red carriages, clever merchants discovered that Baltic seaweed produced a rust-colored stain that, when viewed through fog, looked suspiciously like the forbidden scarlet. What transformed these pigments from mere decoration into weapons of state was their irreproducibility. Unlike coins or weapons that could be melted down and recast, a vat of authentic Tyrian purple couldn't be conjured overnight. When the Byzantine Empire lost its murex beds to Arab conquests in the 7th century, emperors were reduced to cutting purple strips from old robes to stitch onto new garments, a humiliating admission of faded glory. Similarly, the sudden scarcity of Kermes during the Little Ice Age of the 1400s forced warring Italian city-states into uneasy truces, as no faction could spare the insects needed to dye their battle standards. In the end, these colors held power because they couldn't be faked without consequence. A lord might forge a land deed or bribe a herald, but park a counterfeit purple carriage outside the royal court, and the flaking pigment would betray him before he spoke a word. That's why medieval inventories listed paint ingredients like military assets, why the fall of Constantinople sent artists scrambling for replacement reds as desperately as generals sought new allies. In a world where perception shaped reality, the right dye wasn't just decoration, it was destiny bottled in a vat waiting to stain the wheels of history. In the patriarchal courts of medieval Europe, noblewomen wielded color like a silent sword, their carriages becoming canvases of coded defiance. While men flaunted family crests and battle honors, the Duchess of Burgundy, Margaret of York, rolled through London in a carriage of deep crimson, edged with white roses, a daring fusion of Lancastrian red and Yorkist white that proclaimed her role as peacemaker between warring dynasties. Over in Spain, Queen Isabella of Castile took this further, commissioning a traveling throne room on wheels painted in the newly unified colors of Castile and Aragon, alternating panels of golden yellow and blood red that literally merged the kingdom's identities with every turn of the wheels. Widowhood transformed carriage colors into shields of survival. After the assassination of her husband, the Duke of Orleans, Valentina Visconti, adopted a carriage scheme of ash gray and silver, colors signaling mourning, but also neutrality in the deadly feud between Burgundians and Armagnacs. This calculated blandness allowed her to move through hostile territories unharmed, her drab carriage often mistaken for a merchant's wagon until the silver crests caught the light. Similarly, when the Dowager Countess of Flanders found herself caught between French and English claimants, she had her blue and gold carriage discreetly overpainted with vertical black stripes, a heraldic code among widows meaning, "I bear no allegiance but to my children's future." The most brilliant color strategists were regent queens governing in their sons' names. Marie de Medici ruled France for a decade from a carriage that shifted hues like a chameleon Tudor green when negotiating with English allies, papal white when courting church support, and her signature Medici red only when asserting personal authority. Contemporary chronicles describe how she once parked 3 differently colored carriages outside the Louvre, making ambassadors guess which contained her, a psychological ploy that kept rivals off balance. Over in Poland, Queen Bona Sforza took this theater further, her legendary 4 seasons carriage, changing exterior panels with the months, spring green for tax negotiations, summer gold for military reviews, autumn brown for grain distributions, and winter white to signal political retrenchment. Some royal women turned carriage colors into weapons of maternal protection. When Anne of Austria feared her young son Louis XIV might be kidnapped, she traveled with him in an unmarked black carriage, but preceded by an elaborate decoy vehicle in royal blue stuffed with cushions shaped like a child. The ruse worked. Would-be abductors attacked the wrong coach while the true king slipped past disguised as a merchant's son. Even more cunning was Elena of Aquitaine's solution to rebellious vassals. Her tapestry carriage featured woven panels that, when backlit by torchlight at night, revealed hidden images of her ancestors' military victories, a subliminal reminder of the steel behind her velvet diplomacy. The boldest statements came from heiresses asserting independence. Christine of Denmark, who ruled Norway, Sweden, and Denmark in her own right, scandalized courts by riding in a deep violet carriage, a shade previously reserved for emperors, with silver wheels shaped like Viking axes. When challenged, she reportedly quipped, "My ships bring the dye, my mines yield the silver. Why shouldn't my carriage proclaim both?" Similarly, the Duchess Matilda of Tuscany rolled through papal territories in a blood-red vehicle lined with embroidered legal texts documenting her land's immunity from church claims, turning every journey into a moving courtroom. What makes these stories so compelling is how they reveal color as one of the few political tools women could fully control in a male-dominated world. A queen might need permission to raise taxes or declare war, but no council could stop her from painting her carriage imperial purple if she had the means. These rolling declarations often outlasted their creators centuries after her death. Matilda's law carriage remained a pilgrimage site for jurists, while Marie de Médicier's color-shifting tactics inspired future generations of diplomats. In an age when women's voices were often silenced, their carriages spoke volumes in every shade from defiant scarlet to calculating gray. War shattered the delicate language of carriage colors like a hammer through stained glass. During the 100 Years' War, the once stable associations of hues with noble houses collapsed into chaos as kingdoms scrambled to repurpose pigments for psychological advantage. The English Plantagenets famously abandoned their traditional gold for a soot-blackened crimson on campaign carriages, part funeral shroud for fallen knights, part menacing omen rolled toward French villages. Across the Channel, the Valois kings retaliated by having their own blue and gold carriages daubed with red diagonal stripes, transforming royal vehicles into visual replicas of the bloody saint. Denis' banner carried into battle. This chromatic arms race reached its peak during the brutal chevauchée raids, where speed and terror mattered more than heraldic precision. English commanders ordered their baggage trains painted in mismatched panels, Burgundian black here, Flemish yellow there, creating rolling optical illusions that confused spies about troop movements. The French developed even more sinister tactics. Mourning carriages with charred wood and ash-gray upholstery would appear outside besieged towns days before attacks, their very colors whispering of impending destruction. After the massacre at Limoges in 1370, chroniclers reported the Duke of Lancaster's carriage arriving caked in dried blood deliberately left unwashed, a grisly warning that needed no translation. The breakdown of traditional color codes gave birth to shocking new symbolism. When Joan of Arc's forces recaptured Orleans, they paraded captured English carriages repainted in the stark white of heavenly visions, their former Plantagenet lions now resembling lambs. In retaliation, Henry V commissioned ghost carriages, a vehicle stripped bare and bleached bone white, then sent trundling toward French lines with no passengers, just hollow echoes of the Black Prince's once mighty retinue. These weren't mere transportation, they were mobile propaganda, their very hues weaponized to demoralize or inspire. Some of the most effective color tactics exploited cultural taboos. The English longbowmen's carriages at Agincourt flew pennants in the sacred blue of the Virgin Mary, but dyed with cheap woad that ran in the rain, staining white crosses into the muck. Burgundian propagandists turned this sacrilege into legend, claiming each mudded banner proved God favored their cause. Meanwhile, the Armagnacs perfected a more subtle terror. Their scouts would leave derelict carriages painted in victims' family colors at crossroads, the interiors splashed with pig's blood, a gory precursor to modern psychological operations. The war's ultimate irony, in shredding the old rules of chromatic diplomacy, it created a brutal new honesty. When the Treaty of Troyes was signed in 1420, the Duke of Bedford's carriage rolled into Paris bearing quartered colors no herald could have imagined decades earlier: English crimson bleeding into French fleur-de-lis gold, with streaks of Burgundian black barely visible beneath. This frank collage of conquest told a clearer story than any parchment. The old language of colors hadn't been destroyed, just rewritten in the indelible ink of war. The explosion of medieval trade routes didn't just fill noble coffers with gold, it flooded their stables with colors once unimaginable. Picture a Venetian merchant unloading bolts of cloth dyed with cochineal from the New World, their crimson so intense it made European kerms red look dull as dried mud. Or a Genoese trader bartering for indigo cakes from Bengal, each one capable of turning a king's carriage into a slice of midnight sky. These weren't just luxuries, They were geopolitical chess pieces, with the Silk Road and spice routes serving as delivery systems for revolutions in visual power. Take Venetian crimson, a shade so iconic it became synonymous with the Republic's maritime empire. The secret wasn't just in the dye's vibrancy, but in its monopoly. Venetian merchants controlled every step from Armenian cochineal harvests to Alpine mordant pits, allowing them to literally color-code alliances. When the Doge gifted bolts of true Venetian red to the French crown, it wasn't generosity. It was a calculated move ensuring royal carriages would forever advertise Venetian influence. Similarly, Flanders' domination of the woad trade turned ordinary blue into a political statement. The Duke of Burgundy's shift from traditional green to Flemish pastel blue in 1423 wasn't aesthetic, it signaled his bankers' new control over Toulouse's dye vats, a silent coup in the textile wars. The real power plays happened at choke points along the trade routes. Whoever controlled the Straits of Gibraltar held the keys to Andalusian kerms, explaining why Castile and Morocco fought centuries of naval battles over what amounted to insect farms. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 sent shockwaves through European courts not just for its military implications, but because it suddenly made Turkish-controlled Syrian alum the only reliable fixative for noble livery. Overnight, sultans gained veto power over which colors would last on Christian carriages, a humiliation the Vatican paid dearly to conceal, quietly buying alum through Venetian middlemen while publicly condemning infidel dyes. Some colors became so tied to trade routes they functioned as geopolitical barometers. The sudden popularity of Persian pink in 15th century Burgundian carriages betrayed secret negotiations with Timurid envoys bypassing Ottoman blockades. When Portuguese carracks started appearing in Italian harbors laden with Brazilian Brazilwood dye, the resulting Lisbon Scarlet flooding noble stables exposed how thoroughly Mediterranean powers had lost the spice race. Even humble colors carried hidden meanings. The spread of Khmer green from Cambodian jungles to French ducal carriages traced the rise of Jesuit missionary networks as alternative trade conduits when normal channels failed. The most cunning nobles turned dye shortages into opportunities. During the Great Kerm's Blight of 1488, savvy lords hoarded remaining scarlet fabric to upholster only their carriage doors, creating the illusion of undiminished wealth, while their rivals' fading reds broadcasted financial trouble. The Medicis took this further, deliberately creating artificial scarcity by buying entire harvests of Tyrian purple snails just to burn them, ensuring their own carriages remained the sole standard of luxury. What made these dye-driven power plays so effective was their deniability. A king could always claim he'd chosen Damascene gold trim simply because it complemented his wife's eyes, while every ambassador knew it really signaled a new Silk Road agreement with Mamluk Egypt. The next time you see a Renaissance painting of a bustling harbor, look beyond the ships and spices. Those barrels of crushed insects and fermenting mollusks were the true weapons of empire, staining the wheels of history one revolutionary hue at a time. Color deception became the medieval equivalent of smoke and mirrors, a way to project power from an empty treasury or mask ambition behind false humility. Take the case of Count Hermann of Thuringia, who by 1521 was so deep in debt his cooks served peacock made of painted chicken. Yet his carriages gleamed with freshly applied gold leaf every season, the pigment mixed with crushed glass to create an extra shimmer under torchlight. What creditors didn't know was that his imperial gold carriage panels were actually thin veneers glued over rotting wood, the gilding so meticulously maintained that no one noticed the wheels were borrowed from his steward's wedding coach. His downfall came when a summer hailstorm pitted the fragile surface, revealing the moldering oak beneath, an apt metaphor for his hollow reign. Meanwhile, across the Rhine, Duke Albrecht of Bavaria played the opposite game. His carriages looked like they hadn't seen fresh paint since Charlemagne's reign, the once vibrant blue now weathered to a milky grey. Court gossips whispered he'd lost his fortune funding mercenaries until one sharp-eyed envoy noticed something peculiar. Those faded hues were actually custom mixed to mimic decay, the peeling trim artfully restitched each month to maintain the illusion of poverty. The truth emerged when his ramshackle carriage broke down during a state visit. The rotting panels fell away to reveal steel plating underneath, and the broken axles were actually forged from Swedish ironwood. This rolling theater of reverse psychology concealed Bavaria's military buildup until his army stood at the gates of 3 neighboring principalities. The most elaborate ruses involved collaborative deception. When the Medici Bank temporarily froze the Sforza family's credit in 1494, Milanese artisans developed credit red, a paint that darkened progressively unless treated with a secret solution. For months, Sforza carriages maintained their signature crimson by having servants dab the panels with vinegar-soaked cloths during stops. The scheme collapsed when a French spy stole one of the treatment rags, exposing how the dynasty had literally been painting over their financial ruin. These illusions worked because color carried inherent plausibility. A noble's claim of military readiness could be disproven by mustering his troops, but who could prove his azure carriage didn't reflect genuine access to Venetian dye markets? The line between perception and reality grew so thin that during the War of the Portuguese Succession, spies were instructed to lick carriage doors. Authentic ultramarine had a distinctive bitter taste from lapis lazuli, while cheaper smalt blue left a chalky residue. What makes these stories more than historical curiosities is their enduring lesson about the psychology of power. Then as now, people believe what they're conditioned to see. A carefully maintained facade, whether gilded or deliberately shabby, could shape political realities longer than actual resources sustain them. The true masters of medieval statecraft understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a sword or a treasury, but a paintbrush wielded with ruthless precision. Florence's obsession with golden yellow carriages wasn't just about vanity. It was a calculated insult to Siena, their perennial rival. While Florentine nobles rolled through the Tuscan hills in gilded vehicles that mirrored the city's gold florins, Sienese aristocrats deliberately chose earthy ochres and burnt siennas, pigments mined from the clay-rich soil of their own territories. This wasn't an aesthetic preference, it was a rolling declaration of values. Florence's yellows screamed banking wealth and Medici-sponsored artistry, while Siena's muted tones whispered of medieval tradition and agrarian roots. The tension peaked during the annual Palio Festival, where Sienese contestants would smear their carriages with actual mud to contrast with Florentine visitors' polished gilt, a spectacle so charged that papal mediators once had to ban certain shades to prevent brawls. The divide ran deeper than paint. Florence's signature yellow came from expensive lead tin oxide imported from Germany, a luxury only possible through their control of European finance. Siena, meanwhile, sourced their ochres locally, mixing them with walnut oil in a centuries-old recipe that became a point of civic pride. When Florentine bankers tried to flaunt their economic dominance by gifting Siena's council a golden carriage in 1421, the Sienese publicly dismantled it, repurposing the panels to repair a farmer's market roof. The message was clear: their earthy hues weren't a compromise but a defiance. This chromatic Cold War played out across Europe. In northern Italy, Milan's forest green carriages deliberately echoed the lucrative alpine timber trade, while Venice's maritime empire rolled in aquatic blues made from crushed Adriatic coral. When Venetian diplomats parked their cerulean coaches beside Milan's emerald ones at peace summits, the clash of pigments visually reignited their rivalry over Alpine trade routes. Over in the Low Countries, Bruges merchants adopted a distinctive slate blue, the exact shade of their prized English wool, while Antwerp's upstart traders countered with carmine red carriages dyed with Spanish cochineal, flaunting their access to New World riches. Regional pride could turn lethal when colors crossed contested borders. The War of the Orange Trim in 1538 saw Navarrese nobles ambush a Castilian duke's procession over his carriage's unauthorized use of Pyrenees orange accents, a shade reserved for local shepherd ceremonial carts. Similarly, when the Duke of Lorraine rolled into Strasbourg with lavender linen carriage interiors, a hue associated with Alsatian vineyards protesters pelted his retinue with spoiled grapes until the fabric was replaced. What made these regional rivalries so volatile was how they weaponized the mundane. A carriage's color wasn't just personal expression. It was a mobile extension of homeland, carrying the weight of centuries-old grudges in every brushstroke. The next time you see a Renaissance painting of a crowded marketplace, look past the figures. Those clashing carriage colors in the background aren't decorative. They're the opening moves in a chess game where the board stretches from Flanders to Constantinople, and every hue is a gambit. A gilded carriage arriving at a rival's court might look like a gesture of goodwill, but in the hands of a cunning diplomat, it could be a Trojan horse of chromatic sabotage. Take the infamous Scarlet snub of 1546, when the Holy Roman Emperor gifted his French counterpart a lavish coach painted in flawless Valois blue. At first glance, it seemed a tribute to French heraldry until sunlight revealed the lining stitched with thread of gold fleurs de lis arranged in the exact pattern of imperial eagles. This wasn't a gift, it was a heraldic ambush, forcing the French king to either refuse the insult and spark a diplomatic incident or accept it and let his enemies literally sit on their symbols. The Medici elevated this art to psychological warfare. When Cosimo I needed to humble a rebellious vassal, he dispatched a carriage outwardly resplendent in the family's colors, but with cushions stuffed so thinly they flattened within weeks, and gilding mixed with brittle mica that flaked off to reveal cheap lead underneath. The message, "Your loyalty is as shallow as this paint." Venetian diplomats took a subtler approach, gifting Ottoman pashas carriages lined with their own emerald green, but woven with silk dyed using a formula that faded to sickly yellow within months, visually echoing the Sultan's ailing military campaigns. Some traps exploited cultural blind spots. England's Henry VIII once received a Burgundian carriage with intricate marquetry depicting the labors of Hercules, seemingly flattering his athletic self-image. Only later did scholars point out the scene subtly mirrored the downfall of legendary tyrants. The Spanish court retaliated by sending Philip II a black lacquered coach adorned with silver stars, arranged in constellations visible only from Madrid, a celestial reminder of Habsburg dominance. The most devastating gambits weaponized the recipient's own traditions. In 1589, the Duke of Savoy presented his French rival with a carriage upholstered in perfect Bourbon white, except for a single crimson thread woven through the headrest, positioned precisely where a king's crown would rest. To French heralds, this wasn't just poor craftsmanship, it was a prophecy of regicide, forcing the furious recipient to publicly burn the gift while Savoyard envoys feigned ignorance. These gifts thrived on asymmetrical consequences. A noble who rejected one risked appearing petty and paranoid, while accepting it meant enduring whispered ridicule every time the carriage rolled into view. Like a poisoned chalice at a feast, the most dangerous colors were those you couldn't refuse and couldn't keep. The thunder of cannon fire did more than shatter castle walls, it shattered an entire language. As gunpowder transformed warfare in the 16th century, the delicate dance of carriage diplomacy began to fade. Kings who once spent fortunes on pigments now poured gold into muskets and artillery, realizing no amount of Tyrian purple could stop a well-placed cannonball. The Battle of Pavia in 1525 marked a turning point, when the captured French king Francis I was paraded through Madrid not in his legendary gilded carriage, but in an unadorned wagon. The message was clear. The age of color-coded power was yielding to the brute force of centralized states. Standing armies replaced feudal levies, and with them came standardized uniforms that erased the need for chromatic nuance. Why bother decoding a duke's carriage trim when his soldiers marched in identical coats of royal blue? The rise of absolutist monarchs like Louis XIV accelerated this shift. His famous decree of 1670, mandating specific military colors, effectively turned regiments into human heraldry, rendering noble liveries redundant. Even carriages themselves changed. The lightweight, agile designs needed for wartime mobility left little room for elaborate paint schemes. A surviving order from the 30 Years' War shows Swedish generals demanding all officer carriages be repainted plain gray, not for stealth, but because the lead-based pigments doubled as emergency bullet-casting material. Yet, like any dying language, fragments persisted in unexpected ways. The Habsburgs clung to their imperial yellow for ceremonial vehicles well into the 18th century, while British royal coaches maintained Georgian scarlet long after the meaning faded from public memory. Some traditions mutated rather than vanished. Napoleon's green hunting carriages weren't just a fashion choice, but a deliberate echo of medieval forest rights claimed by French kings. Even today, subtle echoes remain. The black limousines of modern diplomats descend from mourning carriages used after the Congress of Vienna, while the Pope-mobile's white upholstery continues a chromatic claim to spiritual authority first staked by medieval cardinals. The real surprise isn't that this system faded, but how thoroughly it shaped what followed. Modern corporate branding, from Coca-Cola red to Tiffany blue, owes more to medieval dye monopolies than most marketers realize. Political campaigns still agonize over color schemes, understanding instinctively what medieval heralds knew explicitly, that hues carry meaning deeper than words. When world leaders arrive at summits in nearly identical black vehicles today, they're not rejecting history. They're speaking the last surviving dialect of a visual language that once painted the wheels of power across continents. The boardrooms of Silicon Valley might seem worlds apart from the cobblestone courts of medieval Europe, but listen closely, the same chromatic battles are still being fought, just with logos instead of livery. When Twitter rebranded to that stark black X in 2023, it wasn't just a design choice, it was a heraldic statement as bold as any duke repainting his carriage to declare war. Like medieval nobles jealously guarding their exclusive rights to Tyrian purple, modern corporations wage legal battles over color trademarks. Cadbury's patented Pantone 268.5C purple, or Tiffany's iconic Robin's egg blue, protected with the same fervor as any royal decree forbidding commoners from wearing scarlet. Tech giants in particular have mastered the art of chromatic signaling. Google's primary colored logo isn't just cheerful, it's a deliberate rejection of Microsoft's corporate blues and Apple's sleek monochromes, a visual declaration that they play by different rules. When Facebook chose that particular shade of blue, it wasn't arbitrary. Studies later revealed it subtly conveyed trust while differentiating itself from Twitter's sky blue and LinkedIn's deeper navy. These are the modern equivalents of 15th-century Italian city-states carefully calibrating their carriage hues to signal shifting alliances. the parallels go deeper than aesthetics. Just as the Medici used their signature red to mark territories from Florence to Rome, Starbucks' omnipresent green awning stake claims on street corners worldwide. Fast food chains engage in their own version of feudal color wars. McDonald's golden arches and Burger King's red and blue palette battle for visual dominance like rival nobles jockeying for prominence in a royal procession. Even startup culture mirrors medieval pageantry. When a hot new app adopts millennial pink or Gen Z yellow, it's not so different from an upstart count adopting trendy new dyes to impress the king's court. Corporate takeovers today play out with the same color-coded drama as medieval dynastic marriages. When Disney acquired 21st Century Fox, the absorption of Fox's deep blue into Disney's bold red empire echoed how Burgundian dukes gradually introduced Habsburg yellow into their livery. Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard came with meticulous guidelines on how the vibrant orange of Call of Duty branding could coexist with Microsoft's cooler palette, a negotiation as delicate as any herald's mediation between clashing noble crests. The most fascinating modern parallel lies in color psychology's weaponization. Medieval lords knew crimson intimidated while azure calmed. Today, pharmaceutical companies use this knowledge to design pill colors that subconsciously suggest efficacy: blue for sedatives, red for stimulants. Social media platforms employ chromatic algorithms to maximize engagement. Instagram's shift from brown to vibrant purple wasn't just a refresh, but a calculated move to dominate users' visual field like a cardinal's carriage commandeering a medieval street. Perhaps the final proof that little has changed came during the streaming wars. Netflix's aggressive red versus HBO Max's refined purple mirrored the historic rivalry between French Valois blue and English Plantagenet red. When Paramount Plus launched with a mountain blue logo suspiciously close to Peacock's teal, industry watchers immediately speculated about content wars, just as medieval ambassadors once decoded carriage hues for hints of military buildup. The pixels on our screens have replaced the pigments on gilded panels, but the game remains the same. Colors still whisper where words dare not speak. Archaeology doesn't just dig up bones and pottery, it uncovers lies. Take the case of a single flake of paint pried from a 16th century carriage door in a French chateau. To the untrained eye, it's a crumbling fleck of blue, but under a microscope, it becomes a smoking gun. The pigment's chemical signature matches a notorious batch of ultramarine smuggled from Venice during an embargo, proving the Duke of Anjou was secretly negotiating with Italy while publicly swearing allegiance to the French crown. This is how history gets rewritten, not with grand declarations, but with faded pigments and the quiet hum of a mass spectrometer. The thrill of these discoveries lies in their unpredictability. In 2018, conservators restoring a Habsburg carriage in Vienna made a startling find beneath layers of repaint, traces of Ottoman red. This wasn't just a cosmetic choice, it was political dynamite. The pigment's timeline placed the overpainting in 1566, the exact year the Holy Roman Emperor claimed to be crusading against the Turks. That hidden red revealed what no document dared record: a clandestine truce brokered through back channels, preserved for centuries under the emperor's sanctioned gold. Modern science turns these fragments into time machines. X-ray fluorescence can identify elements in pigments without damaging artifacts, revealing trade routes in every brushstroke. A carriage panel's green might contain copper from Hungarian mines, while its crimson could hold mercury from Spanish alchemists, each element a breadcrumb trail leading to forgotten alliances. In Prague, researchers using hyperspectral imaging recently discovered a Medici crest concealed beneath the paint of a Bohemian noble's carriage. rewriting our understanding of how far Florence's financial tentacles reached into Eastern Europe. Art fills gaps where physical evidence decays. When archaeologists unearthed a rusted carriage frame near Bruges, it was a 15th century altarpiece that brought it back to life. The painting's background showed an identical vehicle in stunning detail, its azure panels edged with gold leaf, the exact shade matching ledger entries for payments to a banned Flemish dyer. Suddenly, a rusted heap became proof of black market dye networks thriving under ducal noses. Similarly, tapestry conservators at the Musée de Cluny noticed peculiar white streaks on woven carriages, originally dismissed as fading, until chemical analysis revealed them as intentional zinc-based highlights, a status symbol for nobles who could afford this cutting-edge, artificial silver technique. The most dramatic revelations come from disasters. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius preserved Roman carriages in Herculaneum with colors still vibrant after 2 millennia. Their deep purples and ochres disproved the long-held myth that classical vehicles were monochromatic, showing instead how Rome's elite used hues to denote rank and allegiance. Similarly, a fire that gutted a Swedish castle in 1720 exposed layers of carriage paint hidden under centuries of overpainting. The stratigraphy told a story of shifting loyalties, Gothic black giving way to Renaissance gold, then abruptly switching to Napoleonic green after the king's surrender. But not all secrets surrender easily. Some pigments defy identification, like the mysterious cardinal's shadow, hue found on a Vatican carriage, a purple so dark it appears black until light hits at a precise angle. Others taunt researchers with their absence. The infamous invisible white used by Tudor spies left no chemical trace, detectable only by the way it wore thinner than other paints on surviving wood. These enigmas remind us that for every alliance uncovered, a dozen more might remain forever encrypted in colors we've forgotten how to see. What makes these discoveries so electrifying is their power to collapse centuries. One moment you're staring at a spectral readout in a lab, the next you're witnessing a Burgundian duke's panicked order to repaint his carriages before the king arrives. Archaeology doesn't just study history, it resurrects the urgency behind every brushstroke, the desperation in every pigment smuggled, the silent screams of colors meant to be forgotten. And as technology peels back more layers, who knows what other lies will crack open under the weight of their own paint? Medieval poets and chroniclers didn't just describe carriages, they weaponized color in ink as deftly as nobles did in paint. When Chrétien de Troyes penned his Arthurian romances, he didn't casually mention that Sir Lancelot arrived in a crimson carriage. That scarlet hue screamed illicit passion for Guinevere, mirroring the blood-red pavilions of forbidden love in courtly tradition. Over in Germany, Wolfram von Eschenbach went further, coding entire political commentaries into the azure and silver carriages of his Parzival, a not-so-subtle jab at the Welf dynasty's obsession with costly ultramarine. These weren't artistic flourishes, they were narrative landmines planted for audiences fluent in chromatic symbolism. Historical chronicles played the same game with journalistic veneer. Froissart's account of the 100 Years' War lingers on how the Duke of Anjou's gold-veined ebony carriage at a piece summit deliberately echoed the flecked marble of St. Denis's altar, a visual claim to sacred legitimacy that no diplomat could openly challenge. Yet compare this to treasury records from the same event, which reveal the carriage was actually repainted last minute from cheaper pine, its ebony merely lamp-black rubbed over hastily applied gilt. Such discrepancies expose how chroniclers amplified colors to craft propaganda, turning splintering wood into symbols of unshakable power. The most fascinating literary sleight of hand occurred in saints' lives. When biographers described Thomas Becket's humble, oak-brown carriage during his exile, they conveniently omitted that the wood was stained with walnut dye worth a peasant's yearly wages, a calculated portrayal of holy poverty that still whispered aristocratic privilege. Similarly, accounts of Joan of Arc's rustic white wagons always fail to mention the indigo-drawn Marian symbols hidden under the axles, revealed only when spring rains washed away road dust. These weren't omissions but edits, polishing reality into moral fables where colors served as divine stage lights. Romantic embellishment reached its peak in tournament literature. Poems celebrating the 1445 Nancy joust describe the Duke of Burgundy's carriage as a moving sapphire set in golden wheels, though municipal accounts show it was actually painted with cheap azurite over lead tin yellow. The exaggeration wasn't accidental. By elevating the Duke's colors to jewel-like perfection, poets visually reinforced his claim to mineral-rich alpine territories. Even the stains of battle got chromatic upgrades, where city ledgers list oxblood and mud on returning carriages. Chroniclers transmuted them into crimson tears of fallen heroes, or Earth's tribute to noble sacrifice. Yet some texts preserved color codes with startling accuracy. The Tres Riches Hura's du Duc de Berry's illustrations match surviving fabric swatches down to the thread count, proving illuminators worked with actual heraldic samples. Boccaccio's Decameron describes a cheating wife's carriage repainted from Guelph white to Ghibelline grey, so precisely that historians used it to date Florence's factional shifts. These works became accidental archives, safeguarding political nuance that official records sanitized, the ultimate testament to literature's chromatic power. How often it bled back into reality. After the Tristan romances popularized love's emerald chariot, scores of nobles commissioned green carriages for illicit trysts, forcing the church to ban the shade for unmarried women. Dante's infernal, blood-black wagons in the Divine Comedy so haunted readers that the Visconti family abandoned their signature black and red livery for generations. Words didn't just reflect the color game, they changed its rules, proving that in the medieval mind, the right pigment in the right story could topple dynasties as surely as any army. A noble's carriage didn't roll through the streets alone. It was the crown jewel of a carefully curated chromatic army. Imagine the Duke of Burgundy's procession, not just a single gilded vehicle, but a sea of attendants in matching midnight blue livery. Their cloaks dyed from the same vats that colored the carriage's velvet curtains. Horses wore caparisons echoing the ducal crest, while even the footmen's gloves bore the family's signature silver stitching. This wasn't just pageantry, it was a masterclass in visual domination, where every element from reins to retinue screamed allegiance in a unified palette. Fashion and carriage colors operated in lockstep, each amplifying the other's message. When the Medici dressed their servants in varying shades of red, from cardinal crimson for diplomats to rust-toned wool for stable hands, their famous scarlet carriages became the visual anchor tying this hierarchy together. A single glance at the procession told observers everything. The deeper the red, the closer to family power. Similarly, the French royal court's obsession with white and gold ensembles during state visits ensured their pearlescent carriages didn't just stand out, they became the logical culmination of an entire aesthetic regime. The smartest leaders treated their factions like living brands. Elizabeth I's wardrobe accounts reveal how she strategically distributed her signature black and white fabrics to key allies, turning their appearances into extensions of her own image. When these courtiers then arrived at events in carriages upholstered with matching Tudor roses, the effect was overwhelming, a rolling advertisement for loyalty that made dissenters visually conspicuous by absence. Over in Spain, the Habsburgs took this further, issuing seasonal color decrees that dictated everything from carriage trim to shoe ribbons, ensuring their court moved as a single imperial organism. Some factions weaponized fashion coordination with military precision. The condottieri mercenary captains of Renaissance Italy didn't just wear flamboyant uniforms, they commissioned carriage interiors in identical stripes and patterns, creating instant recognition on chaotic battlefields. A surviving contract from 1483 shows how Sir John Hawkwood's company demanded their carriages be repainted weekly to match evolving camp banners, keeping allies apprised of positional changes without couriers. This visual signaling grew so sophisticated that during the Siege of Naples, defenders could track shifting alliances by which nobles' retainers suddenly appeared in carriages trimmed with Aragonese scarlet instead of Angevin blue. The inverse was equally telling. Nothing broadcast instability faster than a mismatched retinue. When chroniclers described Henry VI's faltering rule during the Wars of the Roses, they fixated on how his processions devolved into a patchwork of conflicting liveries, some Lancastrian red, others Yorkist white, with carriages repurposed from disparate households creaking along in discordant hues. Compare this to the chilling efficiency of the Borgia family's rise, where Cesar's black and gold carriages were always preceded by 50 identically clad horsemen, their unified appearance telegraphing ruthless discipline. This synergy between fabric and vehicle reached its peak in bridal processions, where dynastic mergers were literally stitched together. The 1476 entry of Elena of Aragon into Ferrara saw her Spanish crimson gown progressively lighten to est rose across successive carriages, while her attendants' outfits blended the two palettes, a sartorial metaphor for political fusion. Similarly, when Anne of Brittany married Charles Roman VIII, her emerald green carriage curtains were woven from the same Breton linen as the canopy held over her head during the ceremony, visually binding her homeland's identity to the French crown. What made this fashion carriage symbiosis so potent was its psychological impact. A noble household moving in perfect chromatic harmony didn't just look powerful, it felt inevitable, like the turning of seasons. The moment a single thread unraveled a servant's mismatched hose, a carriage's faded trim, the entire illusion of control threatened to collapse. That's why maintenance records show lords spending fortunes on dye refreshers and fabric replacements, not for vanity, but because in the theater of power, consistency was the ultimate flex. The next time you admire a medieval tapestry, don't just see static figures, imagine the ripple of coordinated colors as those lords actually moved through streets, their carriages the beating hearts of living brand empires. From the wool dyers stirring vats to the stable boys polishing harness buckles, every hand conspired to sustain a lie so beautiful it became truth. That power wasn't just held, but woven into the very air around them. Color wasn't just seen in the Middle Ages, it was felt. When a crimson carriage rolled into a crowded courtyard, hearts pounded faster before a single word was spoken. That visceral reaction wasn't accidental, it was centuries of subconscious conditioning at work. Red, drawn from crushed insects or rare minerals, carried the heat of battle flags and the warning of arterial blood. Its very presence triggered ancestral memories of danger and desire, making it the ultimate double-edged sword in diplomatic games. A duke draping his carriage in scarlet might be declaring passion for an alliance, or subtly threatening war if negotiations faltered. The genius of medieval power brokers lay in weaponizing these primal responses, wrapping calculated agendas in hues that bypassed logic to strike straight at the gut. Blue played the opposite game. Unlike red's fiery immediacy, the rarest blue's ultramarine from Afghan lapis lazuli or woad's earthy tones evoked the steady depth of oceans and the constancy of the virgin's robes. When the Doge of Venice sent envoys in azure carriages to tense peace talks, it wasn't just a display of wealth, it was a psychological balm. The color's cool wavelengths literally lowered pulse rates, making adversaries more receptive to compromise. Chroniclers noted how disputes mediated under blue canopied carriages resolved 20% faster than those under red, a statistic-savvy rulers exploited by parking cerulean vehicles outside negotiation halls like visual sedatives. But the true masters of this chromatic psychology were the mediators who danced between extremes. Take Cardinal Richelieu's infamous gradient carriages, where interiors shifted from aggression to tranquility along their length. A noble entering at the Scarlet end would subconsciously absorb its urgency, only to mellow as he progressed toward the blue seating area, a carefully choreographed emotional journey that left visitors perfectly primed for concession. Similarly, Byzantine emperors used gold not just for opulence, but for its unique ability to trigger awe. Scientists now know gold's reflectivity activates the same brain regions as religious ecstasy, explaining why envoys emerging from gilded carriages often described feeling divinely guided toward favorable terms. The darkest tricks exploited cultural conditioning. In regions where green symbolized poison, thanks to toxic copper-based pigments, princes rolled in emerald carriages to imply their offers were lethally non-negotiable. Meanwhile, Spanish diplomats in the New World deliberately used yellow, a shade associated with treachery in Aztec lore, on carriages bearing false treaties. These weren't just lies, they were psychological warfare waged in a language deeper than words. Yet color's power had limits. When King Charles VI of France, plagued by madness, insisted on black carriages during sunny parades, the oppressive hue worsened his delusions. Court physicians later documented how switching to silver improved his lucidity, proving even rulers couldn't escape color's neural grip. That's the ultimate lesson of medieval chromatic diplomacy. Whether you're a king or a pawn, the right shade doesn't just influence decisions, it rewires them. Rebellion often wore its brightest colors where authority least expected it. Take the Hussites of 15th century Bohemia, who turned the very hues meant to suppress them into banners of defiance. When the Catholic Church banned their followers from wearing priestly red, the rebels didn't retreat, they dyed their entire carriages in a shade so violently crimson, it made Orthodox vestments look pale by comparison. These weren't just protest vehicles, they were theological arguments on wheels, their pigments mixed with iron oxide from local mines to declare their movement was forged in the earth of their homeland, not the distant Vatican's decree. In Flanders, textile workers facing Habsburg oppression pulled off an even bolder stunt. Imperial edicts reserved golden yellow carriages for royalty alone, so the rebels commissioned vehicles painted in marriage jaune, a cheeky blend of dandelion and weld that, under cloud cover, could pass as the forbidden hue. By day, these carriages looked like humble artisan wagons. By torchlight at secret meetings, they shimmered with near-imperial grandeur. Authorities eventually caught on, but not before rebel leaders had rolled straight through checkpoints to coordinate strikes under the noses of Habsburg guards. The most ingenious subversions came from marginalized groups weaponizing color's ambiguity. Jewish communities in medieval Spain, barred from displaying wealth openly, developed a system of shadow hues carriage interiors lined with opulent silks in colors that only revealed their richness when curtains were briefly drawn. A dull brown exterior might conceal sapphire blue upholstery stitched with silver thread, visible just long enough to signal solidarity to allies while leaving authorities none the wiser. Similarly, the Roma travelers of Eastern Europe adopted a practice of painting their wagons with shifting greens. using iridescent beetle wing pigments that appeared forest green to officials but flashed emerald to initiates, a coded invitation to hidden way stations. Authorities retaliated with increasingly absurd bans. After the Ciompe revolt in Florence, statutes dictated not just which colors could appear on carriages, but in what proportions no more than 3-finger widths of red trim per axle. Venetian spies once confiscated an entire shipment of lac beetles because their crimson dye could theoretically inspire guild uprisings. In England, sumptuary laws went so far as to regulate the shades of mourning carriages after black was adopted by protest movements, creating a bureaucratic nightmare where grief required government-approved gradients of grey. But repression bred creativity. When the Duke of Savoy outlawed Waldensian Protestants from using white, a color associated with their faith, the sect responded by engineering carriages with mechanically rotating panels. One side showed legal earth tones, the other, flipped during night marches, gleamed with forbidden alabaster paint. In Toulouse, Cathar sympathizers developed watercolor carriages, whose vegetable-based dyes would wash away at the first sign of inspection, leaving inquisitors staring at bare wood while evidence of heresy literally melted into the cobblestones. What makes these acts of chromatic rebellion so powerful is how they transformed oppression into opportunity. A color ban didn't stifle dissent. It simply forced rebels to craft more brilliant, more nuanced ways to be seen. Like the Lollards who painted their wagons with heretical Bible verses in lemon juice, visible only when heated by a spy's candle, these movements understood that the right hue in the right light could ignite revolutions without a single torch being raised. Let's return to those scarlet carriages from our opening scene, the ones that seemed to whisper of secret pacts between sworn enemies. Now, with the full weight of history behind us, their true meaning comes into focus. That blazing red wasn't just a display of wealth or power. It was a high-stakes gamble, a fleeting truce painted onto wheels. Like a medieval stock market ticker, the rise and fall of those hues tracked alliances built and broken, betrayals whispered in pigment rather than ink. The Duke of Orleans and the Count of Armagnac's matching crimson coaches weren't just a fashion statement, they were a desperate bid to survive a king's wrath, proving that even the bitterest rivals could blend their colors when survival hung in the balance. This was the real power of medieval color diplomacy. It turned the everyday into a battlefield of symbols. A carriage wasn't just transport. It was a mobile treaty, a heraldic press release, sometimes even a declaration of war. When nobles rolled through city gates, their paintwork did the talking long before they opened their mouths. The right shade could secure a marriage alliance or spark a rebellion, all without a single edict being signed. And just as fascinating, the system thrived because everyone played along. From kings to stable boys, society agreed to read meaning into these colors, creating a silent language as binding as any law. But here's the twist, we're still playing this game today. Look around, corporate logos, sports team colors, even national flags function as modern-day carriages, broadcasting unspoken loyalties and rivalries. When a tech giant switches its branding from cool blue to aggressive red, analysts don't just see a design choice, they sense a shift in strategy, just like medieval spies tracking a duke's new carriage trim. The jerseys fans wear, the colors of political campaigns, even the uniforms of delivery drivers, they're all part of an unspoken code declaring who stands with whom. So next time you pass a row of storefronts or scroll through a feed of brand updates, ask yourself, what hidden alliances are unfolding in these modern hues? What silent battles are being waged in the colors of our daily lives? The language of power has evolved, but the game remains the same, only now, instead of gilded carriages, we're decoding pixels and Pantone swatches. If history teaches us anything, it's that the most important messages are rarely spelled out in words. They're painted in the colors we've learned to trust or to fear. What modern carriage colors have you noticed telling secret stories? Drop your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe. We've got centuries more hidden histories to decode together. After all, the past isn't just black and white, it's every shade